Today we're going to talk about sequencing. Sequencing is putting things in order based on time or the order that they happen. Authors use sequencing to help make a story make more sense. We use sequencing in everyday life. You don't put on your shoes first and then your socks. You do your socks, then your shoes. There's lots of different ways that you can notice sequencing in a story. Sometimes authors will use time words, such as specific times like 8 a.m., or general times like in the morning. They might give you it based on some set period that we're all familiar with, like lunch, so after lunch, or later in the afternoon, or finally things like that night. These all give you a clue about when something happened in the sequencing. They can also use transition words to help you to know about sequencing. Some of the common ones are first, second, third, fourth, so on, where you're actually counting out the events. You could say before, which lets you know that one comes first and then the other thing comes next. You could say in the beginning, so it would let you know it's happening towards the beginning or before other things. Next and then are pretty generic sequencing words, but when used right after another word, it helps you to know the sequence of it. Afterwards is again letting you know that something comes next. Words like meanwhile or at the same time lets you know two things are happening at the exact same moment in the sequencing. They're both happening simultaneously. Later lets you know something's coming toward the end, and then in the end lets you know you're at the end of your sequencing. Now, if there are no sequencing words at all, no times given, no transition words, you can also look at the ideas in the paragraph, and often authors will sequence them already for you. So if something comes first in the paragraph, it probably came first in sequence. If it's at the end of the paragraph, it probably happened last. You can also look for clues in the sentence, which might give you ideas about what's already happened, and that can help you to put things in order as well. We're going to look at sequencing for this particular story, so we want to pay attention to some of the transition words. It says making cookies. Making cookies is easy enough if you have all of the ingredients and the time. Before gathering your ingredients, you need to preheat the oven to 350 degrees. Then gather your butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, flour, salt, baking soda, and any mix-ins. Mix thoroughly and drop the dough onto the baking pan in small spoonfuls. Finally, place the pan in the oven and bake for 10 minutes until gooey and delicious. Enjoy! Notice the author is giving you several transition words to let you know where you're beginning, what's happening in the middle, and how you're ending. Let's use those transition words to help us to understand the sequencing. So we can use those transition words to know the order that things are happening. It says, what do you do after preheating the oven? Now this is like a right there question. We can find preheating the oven right in our story. It says right here we preheat the oven. Now we want to know what happens after preheating the oven. So looking through my story, I'll change my highlight. It says before gathering your ingredients, you need to preheat the oven to 350 degrees. Then gather your butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, flour, salt, baking soda, and any mix-ins. So what I do after preheating my oven, afterwards, then I gather all my ingredients. So I can use that transition word to let me know that then that's what happens next. It matches up with that word after. If there are no transition words, you can often rely on the order of the sentences in the paragraph. So it says, what do you do after gathering your ingredients? I remember we talked about gathering my ingredients right in this sentence right here. I gather my butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, flour, salt, baking soda, and any mix-ins. Now, I'm looking for another transition word, and I don't have any until I get to finally, but I notice that there's another sentence in here before. So since there are no transition words that are suggesting otherwise, I can assume that the very next sentence would be what I would do after gathering my supplies. So after gathering my supplies, it says I need to mix thoroughly and then drop the dough onto the baking pan in small spoonfuls. So there was no transition word to help me. Because there was no transition word, I could go back into the story and find what was the very next sentence. Notice again, it's like a right there question. I matched up my keywords and it was right there in the story. The very next step is to mix thoroughly. Now you can only rely on the order of the sentences if there are no transition words. So this is saying, what do I do first? If I'm not paying attention to transition words, I might just look right here and say, okay, gather your ingredients. That's the very first thing I do, the end. But that's really not the very first thing I do, because if you pay close attention, notice right here we have a transition word, which means the author may have played around with the ideas. So we need to pay attention to that word. It says, before gathering your ingredients, you need to do something. So I'm thinking about, what do I need to do before gathering my ingredients? What I need to do before gathering my ingredients is I need to preheat the oven. So the author didn't actually put the ideas in order this time. They gave me a clue about something I would do eventually, gather my ingredients, but they're saying before I gather my ingredients I have to do a step, and that step is to preheat the oven. So the very first thing I do, because of that transition word, is I have to preheat the oven. You can see how important those transition words are. I can't just look at the order of the sentences if there are transition words. Now sometimes you can look at the sentence itself and try to figure out some clues about what's already happened and what's happening next to figure out the sequencing. So I have this sentence here, flatten the dough lump slightly for more even baking results. And I want to figure out where that would fit in this sequencing. Let's look for some clues. It says flatten the dough lumps. Well, that means the dough has already been made. So it's going to come after I gather my ingredients, after I preheat my oven, and after I mix it, because I already have dough, not just ingredients. And it's telling me to take that dough and flatten it so it can bake evenly. That means it hasn't been baked yet. So I need to find the sequencing in here somewhere where I have dough, they've been made into lumps, but I haven't baked them yet. I'm going to take this sentence and see where we can move it. Well, in my story here, when I'm gathering my ingredients, it's not dough yet. When I mix thoroughly, I finally have dough, but it's just dough sitting in a pot. That's not what I want. I want it to be in lumps on the pan. Now here it says drop the dough onto the baking pan in small spoonfuls. I know that if I drop them in small spoonfuls, it's going to have little lumps. I'm guessing I'm getting pretty close. My last sentence starts with the word finally. Finally tells me I should be at the very end. So I have to put my sentence before finally, before I start baking. So I'm thinking I would put my sentence right here. Let's see if that makes sense. So it says making cookies is easy enough if you have all the ingredients and the time. Before gathering your ingredients, you need to preheat the oven to 350 degrees. So first preheat the oven, then gather the butter, the sugar, eggs, vanilla, flour, salt, baking soda, and any mix-in. Next, mix thoroughly, then drop the dough onto the baking pan in small spoonfuls. Then I want to flatten the dough lumps, those small spoonfuls slightly, for more even baking results. And finally, I'm going to place the pan in the oven and bake for 10 minutes until gooey and delicious. To me, that sounds like it makes sense. I started with getting the oven ready, getting the ingredients, mixing them together, making them into little balls on the pan, finally flattening them out, putting them in the oven, and baking them. So you can see how by using transition words, by looking at the order of the sentences in the paragraph if there are no transition words, and then by looking for clues within your sentence itself, you can often pay attention to that sequencing and understand the order of how different things happen. Go ahead and move on to the next activity on your website.